Morning Trainiacs. We're going to do something a little bit fun today, slightly pointless and hopefully a little bit interesting. What we've got here is we have my single speed commuter bike, we have my road bike, and then we have my super high-end, top of the line, like basically as many upgrades as you can do, tri-bike. And what we're going to do is we are going to use the same power pedals on all of these, do some tests out and back, and give you a sense of basically how much speed you get as you go from whatever bike you really have in your garage to potentially a road bike, which is the next step that most people make, to a tri-bike. So you can start gauging, all right, well, if I want to put no money into it, here's about what I would ride at. If I want to buy a entry-level road bike, here's about the speed I'd ride at. And if I want to upgrade to the high-end triathlon bike, here's about what I would ride at. Completely unscientific, but a little bit fun and hopefully engaging. Kind of informative. Maybe it'll help some of you. We'll see. Let's do it. So how this test is going to go is we're going to do a bunch of different trials with a bunch of different bikes. With each bike, what we're going to do is two different sections of 150 watts and 210 watts to give you an example of going kind of easy-ish pace, going a little bit harder pace. We're going to go 3.5 minutes out, turn around, 3.5 minutes back, so that we are accounting for the differences in turning abilities between all of the bikes. Then we're going to go back home, see what the data tells us. Spoiler alert, this one's going to be the fastest. We realized something, that I can't take the pedals off of the single speed here. That's often what happens on city and single speed bikes. So we are going to be able to put the power pedals on this, but I know that the roughly average speed that I was doing on the tri-bike and the road bike was around 31k an hour. So what I can do is I've got at least a decent sense of how an effort level feels to get to a certain point. So I'm going to try to get to the 31k an hour, and we're going to use perceived exertion, kind of guess at the power, which is going to be way off, but heart rate is going to give a pretty decent comparison. Next time. Oh, geez. All right, Trainiacs, we've got all the data off the Garmin 1030 Plus. We've synced it all. We've done everything we could to make it as accurate as possible. Now, while I recognize this isn't a scientific test, we're not in a wind tunnel, we're not in a perfectly controlled environment. It's just me, it's not quite a number of people performing the test over and over and over. This can give us at least an indication of how different a performance gain or detriment we're going to have based on the bike that we choose. Now, we know that a tri-bike is going to be the fastest. That's why they exist, and there's a few reasons for that. If you want to dig into a little bit more about when to buy a tri-bike, why to buy a tri-bike, at what point you should buy a tri-bike, go to triathlonbikefoundations.com. This is our book on getting set up with all of your bike gear, when you should buy different bike gear, in what order you should buy different bike gear, when you should actually buy a tri-bike, and when you shouldn't really worry about it. If you don't want to buy it, that's cool, but it is pretty highly rated. We actually recommend that for your first few triathlons, you really just use whatever bike you have. A road bike is fine. A city bike is fine. You don't really need to upgrade to that tri-bike until you know that you are going to be doing triathlons for a long period of time. And the reason for that is because it's a very specific kind of bike. You can't really take a tri-bike out on a group ride with a lot of people. You can't take it off-roading at all like you could with a gravel bike. You really can only do triathlons with it and triathlon training with it Whereas road bikes, you can do triathlons, you can do group rides. Gravel bikes, you can do triathlons. If you change out the tires, you can do group rides, you can do off-road riding. They're a lot more versatile, whereas a tri-bike is going to basically be really specifically dedicated to one thing. And it's also not that comfortable to train on. I probably spend 85% of my training time on the road bike, and really just in the last 3-4 months before a race, I start pulling out the tri-bike to get comfortable in that tri position. Now, the reasons that a tri-bike is going to outperform a road bike are aerodynamics. With the tri-bike, I'll show you this photo here. You can see how tucked in and how small my frontal profile is. About 80% of the drag that we have to push through the air is created by our body, not the bike. So the more we can get into that aero position, the better. And you might be saying, what if I just put a pair of clip-on aero bars onto a road bike? Yeah, that's what we actually recommend for people starting out. But the reason that that isn't excellent long-term is because on a road bike, your hip angle is quite a bit more closed. Whereas on a tri-bike, it's a fair bit more open. So that ends up just being less scrunched up, which results in better run performance when you get off the bike. And remember, we are strained together, swim, bike, run. It's not how fast can you swim and how fast can you bike and how fast can you run. It's how fast can you swim, bike, run. And if you go and you get really, really fast into a really aero position on the bike and you're doing that on a road bike, great, but I guarantee you're not going to have as good a performance on the run as if you put out that same kind of effort on a tri-bike. So now let's finally get into the actual data that we ended up finding. How much slower was the road bike from the tri-bike? So we're going to start off with the 150 watts on the tri-bike. And at 150 watts, I was able to hold 31.2 kilometers. That is roughly around 19 miles per hour. In that 7-minute span, I went 3.65 kilometers. We're talking roughly a little bit over 2 miles. And that was the fastest, obviously. But let's slide over and see how much slower the road bike was. Well, I went 29.7 kilometers per hour, roughly around 18 miles per hour. I rode 3.48 kilometers, and that is 4.81% slower than the tri-bike. Now, how much slower is that going to make us on each of the distances? Well, for a sprint, the average bike finish time is 40 minutes, and it's going to be 1.92 minutes, basically 2 minutes slower than if you were on a tri-bike. On an Olympic, the average time is 1 hour, 20 minutes. So on average, people are going to be just under 4 minutes slower finishing the bike portion of it. On a 70.3 race, you're going to be somewhere just a little bit north of 8.5 minutes slower, and for a full Ironman, around 18.5 minutes slower. Now, in addition to that, these are just the bike times. Remember what I said about not having as good a run performance after the bike? Well, you're going to have a slower bike, as we've demonstrated here, and a slower run if you are using the road bike. So it is significant. Let's move up to the 210 watt effort if you're going a little bit faster. Well, we got up to 35.1 kilometers per hour on the tri-bike, going 4.11 kilometers total. And when we shift over and see how we did on the road at that same effort level, with the same pedals, with the same calibration, we were 33.5 kilometers per hour, going 3.91 total kilometers, going 4.56% slower. How much slower is that for each of the distances? Same sort of thing, a little bit under 2 minutes for a sprint, about 3.5 minutes for an Olympic, a little over 8 minutes for a half Ironman, and right at 17.5 minutes for the Ironman. Now, beyond that, what I noticed out there while I was riding is that there is a fair bit of wind penalty with the road bike. Now, I started at a rolling start and then started at the exact same point every single trial. And what I did was I turned around at 3.5 minutes, and what I found with the road bike is that with the way that I was going when I had the wind more at my back, I went significantly further than on the way out with the road bike. Whereas on the tri bike, it was a lot more even. And what that's telling me is that there's a significant wind and aero penalty to the road bike. That's what we know. This is confirming what we know. And then just for fun, to get up to that same 31 kilometers per hour, which I monitored on this as I was riding on the city bike, the single speed, it was significantly harder. I want to say that that was comparable to, I gotta think how that felt. It felt bad. Somewhere around 250, 60 watts. Like I probably couldn't hold that effort for longer than around 20 or 30 minutes without completely losing it. So we're talking like 10, 15, 20% slower than the tri bike. I certainly don't recommend doing a longer distance race on a single speed bike. No, 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 no. That was not pleasant. But if you're just getting into the sport and you want to do a sprint, you want to do an Olympic, and you want to use whatever fixie bike you got out there, it's only going to make a difference of, who knows, anywhere from 4 to 10 or 15 minutes. And if you're in that sort of case, that's what you're riding, you're probably just looking to finish the race, in which case, use whatever bike you got. That's cool. So I recognize that this isn't a scientific thing, and I'm probably just telling you something that you already know, that a tri bike is going to be faster than a road bike. But here are some stats about how much time you're going to lose sticking with that road bike, so you can make a decision about whether or not you think it's worth it to upgrade. Is that potentially 18.5 minutes in an Ironman worth it to you? It's worth it to me because I'm a triathlete. I'm committed to triathlon, and as we recommend in here, once you get committed to triathlon, then it's time to start worrying about a tri bike. Until then, like I say, use whatever bike you want. Go to triathlonbikefoundations.com. You can get the digital book, the audio book. You can link out to the physical book that is on Amazon. I think it's our highest rated book of all the books that we've done, or not. Either one is cool with me, but if you aren't already subscribed, hit the subscribe button below. Later, Trainiacs.